Yeah, so this is some work that John Burtis and I did for a presentation to the Kenyan Institute of Public Policy Research and Analysis. So Nashin Adaro is a Kenyan fellow that I have been working with on a number of projects. He used to be a member of this Kenyan think tank, and so he knew some people there. So he got us an audience with the director in the institute, and I was able to present to them a week ago Saturday, and it was well received. And hopefully we were asked to provide a policy brief for them. So I did, and John's work was included in, and we hope we'll see some follow on from that. Also, too, another point that I should make is that I think both John and I were able to effectively use some AI tools to help us develop this material, especially the policy brief. Anyways, so the title of the presentation is Making Nairobi Flood Resilient, More Flood Resilient, What Should Be Avoided, Withstood, and Recovered. And the reason we're looking at this is that in March, there was a very serious flood in Nairobi, and 23 people were actually killed in the flood. And so we took this very seriously, and we felt that maybe the Kenyan government and the Nairobi municipal government could do more to make their city more flood resilient, and maybe we could help them with that. And I think these floods are going to continue pretty much, maybe even get worse, especially if they don't maybe take hold of some of these action items that we're suggesting. So let's get into the presentation. So
Daniel, you need to mute.
Sorry.
Yeah, so anyways, flooding is a common occurrence in Nairobi, and they already know the causes of the flooding, and the problem is that they're having problems introducing effective policies and getting those policies to stick. And so our question is, which measures should be funded first, and who should be accountable, and what outcomes should be measured, and why have known solutions not been sustained? I think that's a very important question, is that, there are some initiatives that were done or have been done in the past, and they just haven't been sustained. So the central question is, the central message is Nairobi has a prioritization and delivery problem, not a knowledge problem. We obviously, in the Resilience Working Group, we work around the avoid, withstand, and recover paradigm framework. So in avoid, we were looking at reducing the runoff and obstruction, limiting new exposure, and keeping water away from critical assets. And then in the withstand area, we want to protect life during flooding. So, that's the major concern, is loss of life. However, we also want to maintain emergency access to emergency facilities or emergency services. And we want to keep essential services operating. And then recover, we want to restore services quickly. We want to clear residual damage and disruption. And we want to learn more before the next rainy season. So now the idea is that Nairobi's portfolio may be unbalanced. Current policy appears strong in emergency response, post-event repairs, and proposed infrastructure projects. But it appears weakest in routine risk-based maintenance, protection of service continuity, predefined recovery priorities, and enforcement that prevents new exposure, and also evaluation of policy performance. So the insight here is that Nairobi concentrates resources after the flood, underinvesting in capabilities that prevent flood losses from accumulating. So this is, if you've seen any of my presentations in the past, most of them involve system dynamics. This has a very limited application of system dynamics, but I want to show you one causal loop diagram that you might be able to understand and be familiar with. It's called the capability trap. So here's a causal loop diagram. And so if we start over here with flood losses, we see that flood losses will increase the pressure for an immediate response. So they move in the same direction. And then the pressure for an immediate response will create an emergency response spending. However, the spending on emergency responses will reduce the money left over for investment in resilience capability. And then the resilience capability will decline, and therefore the flood losses will increase. So O means opposite direction, and S means same direction. So this is an actual reinforcing loop, or a vicious cycle, that basically more flood losses lead to more flood losses. Similarly, we have a backlog of recovery. So basically, we have damage that accumulates because of flood losses, and investment in this backlog recovery reduces our ability to invest in capability for resilience, which leads to more flood losses and more recovery backlog. So again, this is another reinforcing loop, a vicious cycle involved with the capability trap, that basically they're looking at short-term results, and because of that, they're finding that they're missing the opportunities of long-term improvements in terms of resilience capability. So that's the general message we're trying to get across. So continually funding response and repair at the expense of resilience capability creates conditions for larger future losses. So let's talk about avoid. So the priority actions here are to protect natural drainage paths, to enforce riparian development controls, to require flood risk assessment for new developments, and to restore retention and infiltration capacity, and prevent solid waste from entering the drainage system. So solid waste in the drainage system can be is one of the serious problems here. And then we want to upgrade the most consequential drainage bottlenecks. And the new insight here is that preventing new exposure is likely to be less expensive than repeatedly protecting or relocating development after it has been established. I'll get back to this when it comes to the equity issue as well, because many of these problems in the flooding affect the poorest people in Nairobi more than the more well-off people. So let's talk about hotspots. So we know that there are hotspots, but we don't want to rank them solely based on flood frequency. We want to prioritize the locations where flooding threatens life and blocks emergency access and disrupts several services simultaneously, and damages critical infrastructure and transfers risk downstream, repeatedly generates high repair costs. So the recommended method of ranking the hotspots is by the expected system-wide loss, not simply water depth or complaint volume. So avoid probably offers the most best near-term near-term return. The strongest candidates for avoiding things is to do a risk-based drain and culvert maintenance, to do waste interception at recurrent choke points, to do pre-rain inspection and clearance, to do protection of critical drainage paths, to target upgrades at high consequence bottlenecks. And these measures are relatively quick to implement. They're less capital intensive than, say, building new infrastructure, and they're useful across different rainfall conditions. They're capable of producing visible results, and the provisional conclusion here is that routine operations like maintenance probably offer a higher near-term return than beginning with large metropolitan drainage projects. That's a little bit counterintuitive, I think, especially for politicians who like to see, large infrastructure projects rather than work on maintenance things. But anyways, I think this is a message that hopefully we can get across. So now we'll talk about withstand and service continuity. So the resilient city does not need to prevent every flood, but it must provide emergency access, health services, electricity and water, public communication, traffic control, airport, and major infrastructure connections. And all of these things were badly damaged during the March flood. So the insight here is that flood depth alone is an inadequate performance measure. More important question is whether critical urban functions remain available. So withstand, we want to map infrastructure whose failure creates cascading disruptions. So such things as road underpasses and bridges, hospital access routes, electricity substations, water and wastewater facilities, emergency service depots, airport access and operating systems, and communications infrastructure. And then for each of these nodes, we can define a flood threshold, a protective action, and backup arrangements, and a responsible agency, and a restoration policy. Okay, so then withstand. So what can we say about using forecasts? Here's something that I like to do when I talk about risk mitigation. Is I like to talk about trigger events. So definitely we need to conduct mitigation. We need to have responses, but how do we activate those responses? And this is where a trigger event can be very useful to say, okay, this trigger occurs, and this is the action that we should carry out when that trigger occurs. So when we have elevated rainfall forecast, we should inspect priority drains and mobilize field teams. And when a critical threshold is approached, we should pre-position pumps, barriers, and rescue. And then when a route becomes unsafe, we need to have road closure, and we need to activate alternative access. And then when a critical asset is threatened, we need to protect, isolate, and switch to backup systems. And when a community threshold is reached, we need to issue localized warnings and evacuation guidance. So, like I said, I like the idea of having this forecast and triggers that lead to decisions for mitigation and response. So the key insight here is that we want to measure the time between a warning trigger and an operational response. So now we'll talk about recover. So recover is more than reconstruction. Recovery should include restoring essential services, reopening critical routes, removing flood debris, supporting displaced households, and repairing damaged infrastructure. And the last one is important. It's closing after action recommendations. So basically, this is making sure that we learn lessons from the previous events. So the insight here is that recovery remains incomplete while service disruption, household displacement, and infrastructure damage and unresolved institutional actions remain outstanding. So we have an idea of a recovery backlog. So I've been using this. I use this as well in the wildfire model that I showed a couple of weeks ago. And recovery backlog is basically the damage that was created by an event and trying to remove that damage or restore the capabilities through recovery. So we need to track the unresolved consequences after each event. So things like households still displaced, roads still restricted, services still disrupted, infrastructure awaiting repair, environmental damage unresolved, after action measures not completed. So a growing recovery backlog indicates declining resilience, even if the immediate emergency response appears successful. So here's an important question. Why previous initiatives may not have been sustained? Now, we don't have, John and I don't have, really clear inside information about this, but we can make some hypotheses. So, for example, 5 likely causes is responsibility is distributed across agencies. Maintenance competes poorly with visible capital projects. Budgets emphasize construction over life cycle operation. Performance is measured by activities rather than outcomes. And political attention declines between major flood events. So these are hypotheses, institutional hypotheses, and that we should test. And so it's not established findings as I said. So principal agency interfaces at risk. So this is interesting as well. So the probable failure points include going from meteorology to county operations, going from county operations to field teams, going from drainage services to waste management, going from road agencies to emergency services, going from utilities to county coordination, going from land use planning to enforcement, and going from response agencies to recovery authorities. So in the March 26th flood, we could develop a decision timeline and identify where information or authority failed to produce action. So that would be like a post-operation analysis and assessment to see where the problems occurred and hopefully resolve them before the next flood occurs. So now we talk about funding. Of course, that's always an issue, and there's limited funding, so we have to manage the funding. So we should protect drainage and inspection clearance, funding for drainage and inspection clearance. We should protect waste interception. We should protect monitoring and communications. We should protect equipment readiness. We should protect operations center staffing. And we should protect exercises and funding on exercises and contingency planning and post-event review and follow-up. So as I said, infrastructure without dependable recurrent funding creates a nominal capacity rather than a reliable resilience. So how should capital projects be appraised? The Kenyan Institute for Public Policy Research and Analysis is primarily an advisor to local and federal governments on economic issues. So we felt that having a way to prioritize capital projects or appraise them would be useful for the KIPPRA organization to proposed to local and federal governments. So we need to evaluate each option against the avoided fatalities and injuries, to avoided service disruption, avoided property and infrastructure loss, a life cycle cost, implementation time, and distributional effects. Distributional effects I think are very important here, because, like I said, the poorest people in Nairobi are the most devastated by these floods, and downstream consequences and performance under more severe events. So KIPPRA can make a contribution by developing a consistent economic appraisal method that recognizes avoided disruption and resilience benefits. So who benefits and who bears the costs? This is, again, the equity issue. So policy appraisal should distinguish benefits to protected communities, benefits to businesses and commuters, benefits from continuity of public services, and then the costs imposed on informal services. So, for example, relocating informal settlements might be a serious cost.
About circuits that acted in nanoseconds.
And land acquisition and relocation costs, downstream changes in flood exposure, and the basic policy implication is that technically effective interventions may remain socially or politically unworkable unless distributional effects are addressed. So another thing that we were suggesting is a scorecard. So a flood resilience scorecard. So again, we go back to the avoid, withstand, and recover paradigm, and we measure things like priority drains that are operational, new exposure prevented, runoff and obstruction reduced. And then under withstand, we measure critical routes available, essential services maintained, and warnings converted into action. And then under recover, we have services restored within target times, recovery backlog declining, and after action measures completed. So we could develop a scorecard for Nairobi that measures these things and maybe provides, I don't know, some kind of quantification of their flood resilience. So then the recommended policy portfolio is to fund first risk-based maintenance, waste interception, forecast to action protocols, critical node protection, service continuity planning. And then prepare next, targeted drainage upgrades, detention and retention, settlement upgrading, and monitoring infrastructure. And then we must continuously control riparian development, new floodplain exposure, life cycle funding, and institutional accountability. So what KIPPRA could do? So KIPPRA could lead a focused policy study to rank high consequence hotspots, to estimate losses associated with service disruption, to compare interventions by avoided loss per shilling, to analyze recurrent and capital funding requirements, to examine institutional failure points, and to assess distributional consequences, and develop this resilience scorecard. So my closing message is that Nairobi cannot avoid every flood. However, it may avoid more exposure and preventable loss. And it can withstand flooding. This is the avoid, withstand again. So avoid more exposure and preventable loss, withstand flooding without widespread service failure, and recover without carrying damage into the next event. So success requires a balanced resilience portfolio around this avoid, withstand, and recover paradigm. So my final thought that I gave the director was that the objective is to avoid preventable losses, withstand disruption, and recover before vulnerabilities accumulate. that was my presentation. I also developed a policy brief, and John developed a technical background note based on loss-driven systems engineering, and we can share that with you if you're interested.
By all means, and thank you, Ivan. Again, I wanted to make the observation that the methodology is applicable to things just beyond flooding. And I see that John Uhas has joined us. Clearly, this methodology is applicable towards other things as well. Looks like John
I assume
left.
that's a question, Ken?
Yeah, no, just making the observation that this would be useful to you. And John B. has raised his hand.
Yeah, and this is a question for Ivan. You know, I didn't think of this previously. One of the types of work is very interested in and very good at prioritizing investments to reduce loss is the insurance industry. Does Nairobi have a healthy insurance industry to bear on the decision making?
That's a very, very good question. Very, very good question. I'm not sure.
That might be worth looking into.
Yeah. I think I would suspect it doesn't, as it
That's my
being
guess.
being a sort of a developing country.
Yes.
They may not have those kind of institutions that in place, and people might be basically on their own to recover from these kind of losses, rather than having some kind of a safety net here. But yeah, that's a good question. I can raise that with I'm meeting with Nashin again on Friday, and we'll be talking about follow on work from this, and I'll mention that to him.
Yeah, because the insurance industry can provide decentralized and distributed incentives to avoid loss. And that, in addition to centralized planning, can be very powerful.
Right, yeah. I think that goes back a little bit to my comment about, or to your comment about my presentation on wildfires, and how you brought in a fire inspector or a fireman to do an inspection of your property, and that could maybe lead to an insurance savings, something like that, on a personal level.
Okay, and John J. has raised his hand.
I just wanted to echo what John Burtis said. Is an excellent suggestion, and it has occurred to us on the project that we're working on, which is striving to improve hospital resilience, that maybe we should be looking at the insurance sector to help make the case for reducing losses. It turns out that when you have to shut down an OR, I've seen numbers like $7,000 an hour of loss, for having to wait for power to come back on, things like that. So we are at some point going to complete our current research, but that is an interesting point of view, and I have not gotten into discovery on where I can connect with an insurance organization that would listen to that message. But that's something. If somebody has any suggestions there, I'd be happy to pursue that.
Well, I think John's point and my point about this is that insurance can create incentives to avoid loss. So basically, if you take these actions, you can reduce your insurance. Or if you don't take the actions, you will have to pay more insurance because you're more at risk. So I think the incentives idea is very powerful here.
Right.
Anyone else?
And if I may follow on to that, the idea of insurance of risk is a classic part of the systems engineering thinking. You take a look at a risk and you can insure it, you can transfer it, you can accept it, you can mitigate it, but insurance should always be on our radar screen.
Yeah.
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 Hey, anyone else?
Yeah, going back to risk analysis, I really feel very strongly about this trigger idea. Maybe John, you can comment on this as well. I think having these triggers highlighted um, to the operational people could be, a real bonus to getting proactive behaviors and being able, like it says, to reduce the time between the trigger and the response. And so, when I do my risk analysis, um, uh, each line, of course, is a risk, and it has a mitigation and response if it occurs, but it also has a trigger to tell me, when should I start really seriously thinking about mitigating or responding, or maybe I mitigate beforehand, but when do I seriously think of responding to this risk, and what is my response plan if this thing is triggered? So I really like this idea of triggering, and I'm not sure, John, maybe you can help me out here. Is that a common thing in risk assessment, risk management, looking at triggers?
I believe it is.
It should be.
In standard risk planning, my recollection is you always try to identify what are the triggers that could cause the risk event to occur. And then relative to that, if that trigger occurs, you develop a contingency plan that will go into effect when the trigger does occur. And that's part of your risk management plan, which then goes into the risk operations activities. So I think that's totally consistent with the systems engineering thinking.
Yeah.
Yes. And
Well,
by the way, Ali has his hand up.
sorry.
Go ahead, Ali.
Yes. First of all, hello everyone. I wasn't in the meeting for a few weeks, and thank you for the great presentation, Ivan. It was a very comprehensive analysis to cover these 3 dimensions of avoid, withstand, and also recovery. One question that I have here is that for each dimension, I see that you propose the different action that must be done to address this problem. One other thing that maybe would be better to be considered also here is what solutions we have for addressing all of these functions. So because the solutions that we provide to answering these functions maybe has some interaction with other functions. And when we look at this function, we must always take this consideration that they are related or they have some interrelationship between these functions, so that we do not make also the solutions that we want to propose to be more complex. So in that case, we were increasing the complexity of this problem. So in that case, I think this could be maybe one step further, that we can go and find some solution for each of these functions or actions that you already mentioned for all of these dimensions.
Yeah,
Thank you.
that's a fabulous point, Ali. A really fabulous point. Because I often tell the people I'm consulting with that one person's solution is another person's problem. And
Yeah.
so, when you transfer boundaries of organizations, let's say you go from meteorology to community response, the meteorology people, may have a solution that is to identify coming bad weather, but then they transfer that information to the community, and it becomes their problem now. How are they going to handle this? So there could be, some definition, some real institutional resilience, not resistance, I mean, to these transfers of information from one institution to another, because it creates problems for other institutions. When one institution actually thinks they have a solution, they transfer it to another institution, and it creates a problem for them. So yeah, I think you have to consider that, and you have to try to realize that there could be problems created by solutions.
Yeah, exactly. Because these kind of problems that are coming with the disaster, actually in general, they are problems that are not in kind of multidisciplinary problems. They are going more toward transdisciplinary problems that different institutions, different sectors are need to be interact and deal with these kind of problems. So the way that they are addressing to these functions for sure has some interaction with the other institution and the other sectors. So in some way, these kind of interactions is important to see how we can define maybe functions that already you defined here, maybe as much as possible independent, so that addressing these kind of functions be much easier, and in that case we do not increase the complexity of addressing this problem.
Yeah, I think there's a great tool in system dynamics that the specialty that I use. It's called archetypes. And archetypes are all about differentiating between the intended consequences of an action and the unintended consequences. So the premise is that every action has an intended consequence and an unintended, or maybe more, intended consequences and unintended consequences. And recognizing the unintended consequences, especially if they're negative, is an important insight that you can have by using these archetypes. And most of these unintended consequences occur at institutional boundaries. Like I said, one person's solution is another person's problem. And of course, the point here, I think we talked about this as well, is aligning incentives. So, how do we get the total system to work together to solve the problem rather than working against each other? So we need to align the incentives. So maybe we align the incentives, say in the Nairobi flooding case, around avoiding loss of life or something like that, and then everybody works towards that same goal, rather than, say, being in their silos and working primarily to either retain resources for themselves, or possibly reduce the amount of work they have to do. So anyways, I think that this is a very, very good point you've made. And I think it's central to systems thinking to look at unintended consequences and to align incentives across organizations and institutions.
Thank you. Thank you for your explanation.
Anyone else? Okay, Reza, I see you talking in the background. Are you muted, sir? I think you are muted. Or your audio is not working. Sorry. Anyone else while Reza tries to figure out connectivity issues here?
Well, just a point, as I said, John and I developed these policy documents, and I think, I think these policy briefs are a very important tool to get our resilience message across to, say, decision makers and policymakers. So I personally, I think we need to perfect these kinds of very short, sharp documents that can help decision makers, especially politicians, make decisions better. So I'd like to share these policy briefs that John and I did, and get your comments, and maybe together we can work on similar things for other issues involving resilience, or anything that you think you need to work on to get some influence amongst decision makers.
I most certainly would be interested in that. There was a period of my life where I was involved in federal wildlands firefighting, policy making, response, and the whole preparation, mitigation, operations or engagement in the recovery restoration phases, and considerable feedback on the realities of that situation. So let's chat, okay?
Great. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone, for your great questions. And
Can you hear me, Ken?
Oh,
Yeah.
yes. Now we can hear you, Reza.
Oh,
Okay. Go ahead
great,
with your
great.
question, sir.
Okay. Hello. Thank you. Well, in fact, I was looking at the dynamic part of a ontology. The resiliency has the ontology that we have for resiliency can have it's a domain related, so similar to the conversation we are here talking about, whether the country has a policy with respect to insurance and so these the basis for the ontology that I was looking at, it was classifying the domain, build ontology based on the classification, classes of, let's say, for example, you're building a class of countries which they needed flood policies, but you have to classify it as a developed country, underdeveloped country, and the whole concept attribute for the classes make these country into the different category, and then you base when you want to build an ontology, you have to look at this classification and then come up with the specific, real domain that apply to a specific countries or a specific issue that you are trying to, or the system that you are trying to build a resiliency. So what I'm trying to say is the attribute, the ontology that we build, the primer that we build, it requires some dynamic aspect that make us to make right decision, or some other digital way of basically one of the definition of digital threat is to make you to make a right decision. The reason you build a digital threat to make a right decision. So that's something that I don't know whether we have it discussed in the primer with respect to this dynamic aspect of domain or the accurate domain that we have to select to build our oncology based on that. It was just a comment that I had.
Yeah, I think that's a great comment, Reza. Like floods are happening all over the world, and we see them almost every day in the news, and they have severe consequences. Some have loss of life, but in most developed countries, there's limited loss of life. In Nairobi, it was severe loss of life. I considered severe levels of loss of life. But the solutions that we're recommending for Nairobi are specific to Nairobi. So, in a developed country with a different set of infrastructure, maybe we would have different recommendations. So the context is so important when we make recommendations to understand the differences between the different countries, the different cities, the different infrastructure types. However, the basic premise of avoid, withstand, and recover, I think, stands tall here and really can do a lot of the work of coming up with recommendations. Even though the infrastructure may be different and the problems may be slightly different, the whole avoid, withstand, recover paradigm, I think, really is a great piece of work that we can use to make recommendations.
Thank you.
Okay, and Jacob has his hand up.
Hi, Jacob Applebaum. I think this is the first one I've come to actually. But I have two questions. One's more pointed at the like the conclusion slides. Like with recovery for, at least in this, scenario, this use case, does that cover, responding and managing displaced persons, like especially if their residences are, no longer there, they're washed away? Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, it definitely does. Maybe I glossed over it a little bit, but as I said, the recovery is not completed until we've got the displaced people back and settled again. So, and the recovery is not completed until until basically the recovery backlog is the issue about recovery. It's not completed until the backlog of recovery actions have been completed. So, so say in this case we had a flood and we had a lot of people in the floodplains displaced. Well, the recovery is not complete until those people are resettled. And that, of course, requires a lot of thinking about how that's going to work, because you don't want to maybe necessarily place them back in a risk position for the next flood. So yeah, I think definitely the displaced people are in this presentation. Maybe I should give them more emphasis than I did, uh, but um, but I did include them in the recovery idea.
Thank you. I guess this also kind of um, just had another question pop up. It's, I don't know like what the flooding frequency is, but like how do, is prioritization of the backlog items like change if another flood happens like in quick succession, to the first flood? Um, do you just have to like start the whole process over, or can there be, parallel efforts? Is it a very linear process, or uh, you know, can it be fragmented and parallel things happening at the same time?
Yeah, that's a great point too. That you could have recovery that is disrupted by another event. So maybe thinking about resilient policies, resilient actions that you can take to make sure your recovery actions aren't disrupted. So it's sort of like a sub problem to look at not just the recovery but also the resilience of the recovery, which is a sub resilience problem. How do we make sure that we're going to recover effectively if there is another disruption, and how do we prioritize our actions to make sure that our recovery processes are resilient like that. So I think that's a very interesting perspective you've got there, Jacob. And I don't think I addressed that in my work. I was sort of assuming that we were going to do our best to recover as much of the recovery backlog as possible between events, and that if we weren't completely recovered, then that was showing signs of a lack of resilience. But
Yeah.
then the whole idea of how you recover is also a question for resilience to study as well.
Thank you for the response. And I guess just generally, I'm pretty interested in resilient systems, but I'm not exactly working in that domain right now, more in defense. Um, how do you kind of make a transition into, working on resilient system engineering?
May I make a suggestion? Ken Curitan here. Most certainly, resilience in defense systems is a critical thing, which many of us can testify. And Eileen and John and others, that's what we did for a living. We wouldn't call ourselves resilience engineers. We were system engineers that used resilience techniques. May I suggest taking a close look at the primer, resilience primer, that is available out on Incosi Connect as soon as Incosi Connect comes back up. Under the documents with this working group, you'll find resilience primer, and that will provide a lot of good information, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, we have this three-level taxonomy that we've developed, and these different levels involve potential techniques, actions you can take, and the actions are numerous, and many of them apply to defense. So, for example, what's the term, John? Layers of defense or something like this, or
defense in depth.
Defense in depth, yeah.
Correct.
So that's a big part of one of the tools for helping people develop resilient systems, yeah. and obviously, defense in depth can be easily directed to defense projects.
And by the way, if you want to see the detail of the three-layer taxonomy, the best place is probably the CBOC. There's a section in the CBOC dedicated to resilience, and it goes into quite a bit of depth on that.
Okay.
And that is also available via the INCOSE Connect. But if you simply go out to the systems engineering body of knowledge and look up system resilience, you'll find a whole article on this that has what John is talking about in great depth.
Okay, thank you so much.
Right. And version 5 of the INCOSE Systems Engineering Handbook has a section on resilience also that you might find interesting.
Both of which have a number of more in-depth references at the bottom that you can look if you need more information.